Hello. This is going to be the first of um, a series of several ecology video clips. Um, a couple of things to know. First of all, I'm an ecologist, so this is what I get. I'm going to say most excited about and most long-winded about, perhaps. So, you know, good luck to you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I don't know that I've mentioned this before. I apologize if I have mentioned it and you're like, yeah, we know already. You might notice that there's often a little picture in the corner of my lectures. Usually it has something to do with the theme or a topic in that lecture. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing to pay attention to. Sometimes it's a little bit of a puzzle. Sometimes it's something that is sort of explicitly mentioned. So anyway, it's not just there because it's pretty, right? So I didn't just put poppies here because I like poppies, although I do, and you know that because I have some. Um, anyway, okay. So this is the first, like I said, the first of a series of ecology videos. And so this one's going to be kind of like an introduction to what is ecology study, what are the different kinds of ecology, what are the different ways of doing ecology, that kind of stuff. And then we're going to break the topic of population ecology into smaller chunks, okay? And then after that, then we're going to explore community ecology and sort of big picture ecology. Okay, so this is gonna be a couple weeks worth of discussion for us. Okay, all right. So why not start here? Why does ecology matter? So many reasons. One of the things that I always kind of find myself thinking about when I'm talking to a audience of people who aren't bio majors, right? So the vast majority of you are not biology majors or even science majors, right? So you're just, people trying to live in the world, right? And you don't necessarily feel super passionate or excited about science. So why should this matter to you? Well, ecology is important because as a member of, life on Earth, right? As a part of that, the way that we sort of interact with the rest of the world really is important for us in a variety of ways. Some of those are very sort of self-serving, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but just, like we want to have clean air because we want to have clean air because, we like to breathe. We want to have clean water because, we need that. So some of it is very sort of practical self-serving, but some of it is really, emotional or spiritual enrichment as well. So that's where we're going to kind of start is talk a little bit about why ecology matters. And so here's just a few sort of thought-provoking images to get you to think about. As far as what those practical matters are. So, like I mentioned, things like having clean water, having clean air, having a healthy environment for organisms that we depend on for a variety of different things. Those things are kind of obvious, but other things might not be. So another thing that people don't think about until it affects you is people don't think about things like, or at least people around here don't think so much about things like erosion control, for example, right? So, you know, how does ecology help you deal with a mudslide, right? That's an important thing to think about, okay? And so all of these things, are what we call ecosystem services, okay? There's other really practical things as well. So the vast majority of medicines are things that are produced, at least originally, perhaps they're made synthetically now, but many, many, many medications that are produced nowadays that do everything from serve as antibiotics to treatments for cancer, right? Many, many medications are derived from other living things, from plants, from animals, from fungi, right? From bacteria. And so this is a really important thing to think about. So in taking care of the earth, in being aware of how living things kind of interact with each other, right? We're potentially making things better for ourselves. Okay. All right. In addition to those really sort of utilitarian things, right? We have to understand how plants grow in order to get food. We have to understand, how pests infect plants so that we can understand how to protect them. There's all kinds of more, less tangible, less utilitarian uses. So appreciation of nature, the aesthetic value of nature. A lot of you in your little introductions of yourself talk about how you like to go hiking, right? And so, probably the reason many of you like to hike rather than say just hitting the treadmill in the gym is because it's beautiful being outside, right? And there's a lot of symbolism in nature too. One thing though that a lot of people kind of devalue is something, a phenomenon that we call biophilia. So philia means love, right? So biophilia, it literally translates to love of life. But basically, biophilia is this idea that people are, by our nature, kind of like enchanted with animals and plants, and it's a little different for everybody, right? But this idea that we have this fondness for living things because we're part of that, right? And so this term was coined by a biologist named E.O. Wilson, and you guys actually have heard him in a video before. So the evolutionary arms race video, he's in that. I want to say it's towards the end, middle or end, talking about a few different things. So biophilia is this sort of fondness for life. And so he's the man who coined that term. But basically it's this idea that just nature makes us happy. People like to go to the zoo. Why do we like to go to the zoo? It's not utilitarian. It's because it's like, oh, look at all these cool animals, right? Okay. Another one of his projects, so he's an ecologist. Another one of his projects is something called the 100 Heartbeats Club. And so the 100 Heartbeats Club it's not a club you want to be in. Okay. The 100 Heartbeats Club is used to describe critically endangered organisms, right? And so these animals, I've been using this slide that has examples of critters from the 100 Heartbeats Club. I don't know, for a long time. How long have I been teaching this class? Okay. Since I started teaching this class, 2 of them have gone extinct, right? So the Chinese river dolphins are gone. This particular species of tree frogs, gone. These majestic beasts here on the top, so this is a Javan rhinoceros, critically endangered, only a handful of individuals left. And this amazing beast right here, like, is that not the most like majestic bird you've ever seen? It's called a Philippine eagle, right? And they are also super critically endangered. And so the 100 Heartbeats Club is like this idea of literally there are fewer than 100 individuals left, 100 heartbeats away from extinction. And so this is kind of another one of these sort of charming, sad things to think about when thinking about how we can protect organisms. And we're actually going to talk more about conservation and restoration and all of that kind of as wrapping up at the end of this section. Okay, so there's that. All right. One of the things I talked about a little bit in our macroevolution conversation is I talked about how many biologists say that we're currently in the midst of a sixth mass extinction. We're losing species every day, particularly amphibians. Amphibians are they're having a rough time with things going the way they are, but human impact is significant. And so this is the last passenger pigeon on Earth. Her name was Martha, right? Died 100 years ago, okay? And there's lots of examples like that of species that we're seeing disappear before, during our lifetimes, right? So we're seeing a lot of that happening. Okay, so why should we care? We should care because ecology is important for our day-to-day lives. And I'm going to show you some of the different ways kind of as we go. I talked about some, but I'm going to show you some more. But also we should care for aesthetic reasons and just happiness, right? There have been all kinds of studies that show that people actually learn better. People have reduced stress levels when they spend time in nature. Right? And so being outside in nature helps you learn better, right? It reduces your stress level. It's better for your health. And I don't just mean the exercise part of it. Certainly that's part of it, right? But even if you're not exercising per se, right? Or if you are exercising inside a gym versus, outside in nature, being in nature has huge health benefits, both mental health and physical health. Okay, so anyway. So there's that. So, okay, so that's why you should care. So the next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about sort of different ways of doing ecology. But before that, there's one other thing that I want to make sure to address before we get too far. And that is, what is the difference between ecology and environmentalism? Okay, so this is actually really, I'm just going to use this slide as a place to kind of jot a couple things. Ecology versus environmentalism. Okay, so ecology is a science. Ecology is the study of how living organisms interact with each other and their environment. Okay, and we're going to talk about different ways that you can study that. So it's science. It is a science. Environmentalism is a social movement. Okay, they are not the same thing, and the reason I'm making a point of this is because I think it's important to realize that there's a difference between being involved in a campaign or a movement, or anytime you're trying to get people to realize that something is important, and studying something in a dispassionate way as a scientist. Okay, so ecology and environmentalism are fundamentally different things. This is not to say that an ecologist can't also be an environmentalist, but they're different. So let me explain what I mean. An ecologist is a scientist who studies ecological topics. They are not necessarily in, sort of the social movement of trying to get people to care about, nature, getting people to recycle or what have you. Environmentalists are often people that feel very passionately about, save the earth, right? About, environmental protections and things like that. But they may or may not have much understanding of the science of ecology. So these are kind of separate things. And so just to kind of give you an example, well, that's not really a good example. Anyway, okay, so they're not necessarily the same thing. So it would be a mistake to assume that anybody that studies nature has is sort of automatically involved in a movement to protect nature. And the opposite is true as well. It would be a mistake to assume that anybody who is an environmentalist studies and understands how organisms interact with each other. Okay, so one is science, one is a social movement. All right. Okay, where were we? So that's just an important thing to kind of have in the back of your head. All right, there are a couple of different ways of being an ecologist. We've spent the first portion of the semester talking about the scientific method and how do scientists actually go about doing science? How do scientists answer questions, right? We've been talking about that. What we've been talking about is we've been talking about experimental biology, right? Where you have a question about something, you make a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis, right? That's not the only way to do science. So another way of doing science is observational. And so observational ecology, we often call natural history. The big thing about observational biology, okay, whether it's ecology or something else, is that it's less about testing a hypothesis. In fact, it usually doesn't really have like a hypothesis in the strict sense that you're testing. And it's more about just collecting data and seeing what's out there, okay? Charles Darwin was a natural historian, right? He visited places and learned and collected specimens and wrote down his observations, right? He didn't do experiments where he had a control group and an experimental group and he looked at, you know, manipulating different variables and see what happens. He didn't do that. He wasn't that kind of a scientist, right? He was a natural historian. I think that a lot of people think that natural history is old because we've already discovered everything that's out there. One of my favorite responses every semester that students say to the hot-headed naked ice borers is they talk about, well, if this was a real thing, I'm sure I would have known about it already, right? So we have this like idea that, oh, I've already heard, I know about everything already. And the fact of the matter is that you don't. And I can feel confident saying that because A, you know, there's only so much media we can consume, right? And there's only so many different things that they talk about on Animal Planet, okay? But secondly, right, we're finding new organisms still all the time, right? So even though travel is a lot easier, so we've explored and documented more of the earth, there are still places that are harder to get to where we are still learning a lot, okay? And so these guys, these three gentlemen in this tree, this is really old picture, by the way. Look at the computer that he's using. It's crazy. What these guys are doing is they used a little blimp, right, as a way of essentially lifting them up into the air and plopping them down on the tops of trees in the rainforest. You're going to learn more about rainforests in the next couple of weeks. One of the things you'll learn is that one of the, you know, sort of defining characteristics of rainforests is that they have incredibly tall trees, like 300-foot tall trees. And one of the really charming things about rainforests is many of the living things don't live on the ground. They live in the trees. So there are lots of organisms that spend their whole life and they never ever touch the ground because they live up in these trees. And life is kind of stratified. So the organisms that live up in the top of the tree is different from the middle, which is different from the bottom, which is different from the ground, right? And so these guys are studying insects in the tops of the trees. And so they're using that blimp because, you know, who's going to climb a 300-foot tree? Like that's, how do you do that, right? So they have this like blimp with essentially like a raft almost with netting and it just plops them down, right? So they can study this stuff because it's a hard place for people to get to. Another example is deep oceans, right? So Deep, 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 deep oceans are hard to get to. So we have all these submersibles that can go, you know, all the way down into the depths. But it's another place that it's hard to get to. So we don't, you know, we're constantly finding new things down there that we didn't know were there before. Okay. Another place is caves. Caves, especially caves that are filled with water, are really dangerous for people to explore. And so, you know, this is another area where, you know, we find new things in caves all the time, right? So, you know, it's kind of funny. It's like, oh, a new species of, you know, you see a headline, oh, a new species of shrimp was discovered. And before I read any further, I try to guess. Okay, it was either, you know, in the super deep ocean by the hydrothermal vents, or it's from a cave. Let's see which one it is and then read further, right? So there are still places where we don't know, even, you know, as much as we know about this planet, there are still a lot of places that we don't know everything that's there. And so that's natural history, right? So the whole goal of natural history is basically just to see what's out there, right? Just to explore, essentially, and find out what's out there. Not necessarily to manipulate anything, not to test anything, but just see what's there, okay? Then, of course, we have experimental ecology. And experimental ecology is hypothesis-driven science, right? So now we're doing the scientific method. The funny thing about experimental ecology is that it's really hard, and I'm biased, of course, because this is the kind of science that I do, but it's really, really tricky, right? If you're a lab scientist, you can control all kinds of different variables pretty easily, right? Like, I need to control the temperature of this thing, so I'm going to put it in a temperature controlled environment. Cool. I need to control, you know, whatever. Okay. It's a lot harder to control nature, right? And so experimental ecology is a really kind of interesting field because you're trying to set up controlled experiments, right? Where you're limiting your variables and you're only wanting to manipulate, you know, whatever your experimental variable is, and, you know, trying to keep it really targeted and focused. At the same time, you want to have a decent sample size and, you know, yada, yada, yada. And that's really hard to do. So this picture is just a really kind of fun example of like extreme experimental ecology. So the researcher that did this experiment, what he wanted to know is he was studying how fertilizer runoff, like fertilizer used on crops, right? How the runoff from irrigated fields that have used fertilizer affects aquatic environments, affects ponds, okay, and lakes. And so what he did is he found a naturally occurring lake that is shaped like an hourglass, right? So the lake is shaped, you can't see, you know, the edges of it because the picture cuts off, but it's naturally shaped like that. And so there's like a narrow part in the middle there, okay? And what he did is he literally built a wall in that narrow part, essentially creating two separate lakes, basically. And then he used one as his control, and he threw a bunch of fertilizer into the other one to see what would happen, right? So he's got his control group, he's got his experimental group. Not a very big sample size, right? Because he's just got one of each. He's not going to do this with every lake around the world, right? So his sample size, his replication is not fantastic, right? But sometimes that you have to let that go in ecology. You can't have perfect, you know, perfect studies all the time. But that's a, you know, and then so he literally like dumped fertilizer in the one, right? His experimental, you know, sample, and documented the differences between the two. And anyway, so that's like extreme experimental ecology. Okay. Anyway, okay, so you can do it both ways. All right. The different sort of levels that we can engage with ecology. Like I said, ecology in general, what did I say? I said ecology in general is the scientific study. It'd be good if I could spell that. Scientific study of how organisms interact with their environment and I'm running out of space, each other. You'd think I would leave myself more white space to deal with, but no, I don't think about that when I'm making the PowerPoint. So that's ecology in general, okay? You can do ecology at sort of 4 different levels. So in chapter 1, one of the things we talked about was how you can study biology at a lot of different levels, right? At the level of cells or, you know, populations or whatever, okay? So within ecology, the fish tank just turned off. My lighting changed. Now I look very like, I don't know, it looks like a haunted house or something now. It's not that late, by the way. Somebody made a comment about how I do all my filming late. Yeah, but it's only like 8:30, I think. Anyway, sorry, back on topic. Okay, so different levels that we can study ecology. One of them is organismal ecology. So this picture has been chosen to represent organismal ecology. Basically what organismal ecology is you're looking at how individuals meet the challenges of their environment. Okay, so how individuals meet the challenges of their environment. I'm abbreviating environment. Okay, so here's an adorable little coyote here howling away. And so if we were studying coyote ecology, we might ask questions about, you know, how does he handle temperature variation, right? So how does his body, how does his physiology handle hot summers and cold winters? That will be an example of an organismal ecology question, right? So how do individual organisms, right, sort of meet the challenges of their environment? And so I hope that you can see the relationship between this and natural selection, right? So like, what characteristics or traits do you have that allow you to be well suited for your environment, okay? So things like regulating body temperature, that's a really good example of something that you might study if you were an organismal ecologist, right? And so we're not going to talk about a ton of these topics in much detail. We might talk a little bit about body temperature regulation, but probably not a ton. It might come up, we'll see, okay? So that's organismal ecology. That's sort of like the smallest level of ecology, okay? Then you have population ecology. Aren't these pups adorable? So to understand what population ecology is, you have to know what a population is. I'm going to take a sip of water. You're going to think about that. So say it out loud. What is a population? Define a population for me. I'm listening. So tacky, so tacky. Okay. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species that interact. So what must population ecology be? Population ecology studies how, how individuals of a species interact with each other. And their environment. And so this is the first big like area of area of ecology that we're going to focus on. So the rest of this week is going to be primarily focused on this. Okay. So what kinds of topics does that include? It would include things like population growth, population shrinking. It would include things like competition between individuals of the same species, right? So how, you know, in the case of dogs, they often live in packs, in family groups, right? And they hunt together. So in that case, cooperation would be, you know, how they cooperate with each other would be, you know, potentially a population ecology topic, or how one pack of, you know, coyotes interacts with another pack, right? Um, yeah, so competition is a good one. How individuals find mates, right? Mating would be another, births and deaths, right? Would be another population ecology topic. So there will be more, much more detail about this, okay? But that's kind of the nugget. Okay, community ecology. What's the deal with community ecology? So once again, you have to know what a community is to understand community ecology. So how, the way that it's defined in biology, because that's the trick, right, is in, you know, everyday English, population and community might mean the same thing. They might mean different things, but it's a very different kind of definition than what it means in biology. So what is a community in biology? A community is a group of different species that interact with each other. Okay, so whereas population ecology is all about individuals of the same species and how they're interacting with each other, community ecology is about how different species interact. Okay, so what picture are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at our little coyote friend. We can also see a bear. You can also see some sort of large hoofed animal that the bear is standing on. So probably an elk or a moose or something. And the coyote's like, I think I kind of want to eat some of that elk. You want to share with me? And Mr. Bear is like, no. Right? And then you're also seeing a bird in the background, and you're also seeing plants. And so um, community ecology is about how different species interact. So in this case, we're looking at things like competition, right? Competition between the coyote and the bear for food. We're also looking at things like predation, right? So a predator eating their prey, that would be community ecology. Right? So all kinds of interactions that involve multiple species is community ecology. Okay, so okay, and so that's going to be more of our focus next week. Okay, all right. The last area of ecology that we can focus on, at least big area, is ecosystem ecology. And so once again, this comes back to this idea of you need to know what an ecosystem is. So an ecosystem is, when we talk about ecosystems, we're talking about typically large areas that have like a particular type of climate, and um, we're thinking about all of the different organisms that are in that ecosystem and how they interact with not only each other, but also like the physical world as well. Okay. So ecosystem ecology, now we're not looking at it in such a like a narrow way where we're looking at individual species, right? Now we're looking at like big picture. So we're thinking about how do plants respond to the climate of this mountainous area. We're talking about what is the food web like of organisms that live in this area, right? So food web is kind of like a food chain, but more complicated. We'll do examples of that later, okay? So this is really like big picture interactions between organisms and also their abiotic environment. I'll write down what that is as well, okay? So studies interactions between organisms, you should say all organisms in an area, and the abiotic factors that affect them. Okay, so abiotic, what does that mean, abiotic? What does it mean when you put a in front of a word? That's right, it means without. So abiotic then means without life, right? So what are abiotic factors that affect an ecosystem? Things like sunshine, things like weather, so amount of precipitation, the temperature, air temperature, the amount of minerals in the soil or soil texture. Any kind of extreme weather events would also be an abiotic factor. How about fires, floods, natural disasters? Those are often abiotic. Okay, so any kind of factor that impacts living things that itself is not alive is an abiotic factor. Conversely, we could talk about biotic factors. What is a biotic factor? Well, a lot of the things that we've been talking about in these examples are biotic factors. So competition, either between individuals within a species or between individuals of different species, competition, biotic factor. Predator-prey relationships, so feeding relationships, biotic factor. Disease transmission, biotic factor, right? So anything that involves living things interacting with each other is a biotic factor, okay? Food is a biotic factor, unless you're a plant. Okay. So here's another little summary way of looking at that, right? So individual ecology, we're looking at individual organisms and how they meet the challenges of their environment, right? A population is a group of individuals that interbreed with each other, right? So we're looking at how those individuals within a population are interacting with each other. Communities, populations of different species that interact with each other within a specific area, right? So they have to interact. And then ecosystems, yeah, all living organisms as well as non-living elements that interact within a particular area. Okay, so that's kind of the little summary. All right. So like I said, where we're gonna start is we're gonna start by focusing on populations. Okay, we're gonna talk about all kinds of different aspects of population ecology, starting with what is a population, starting with how do you know about populations, and then kind of investigating different things that can affect populations, so how they grow, all of that. Why does this matter to you? So, here's a beautiful picture of fish, right? There are many populations that we depend on for food and other things. And so making sure that those populations are healthy, right, is really important, okay? Similarly, making sure that we are utilizing our resources to the best of our ability, our living resources, right, like plants and things like that, is another kind of aspect of population ecology. You need to make sure that populations are healthy if you want to utilize them. Okay, so that's kind of the punchline. All right, so I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop here, and then we'll start talking about some of the different areas of population ecology in a handful of other videos. Okay. All right. So let's stop recording on this one. See you in a couple minutes.